Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and today I wanted to make a discussion video kind of thing talking about rereading books. So this topic has been going around BookTube a little bit in the last few weeks. Helene from Books by Leynes made a really good discussion video on rereading books. Courtney from Classics with Courtney also made a video about the books that she loves to reread. And Agne from Beyond the Pages made a video about the books she would like to reread in the future. And I wanted to join in this discussion because I've been rereading a lot this year and I've been really enjoying rereading. Something I hear a lot of people say is that as children, as teenagers, they reread a lot. They used to read the same books over and over again, and then as they grew into adulthood, they stopped. I didn't have that experience at all. As a child and a teenager, I was not a rereader. Until the last few years, I barely ever reread anything unless I was studying it at school or university. With the exception of Charles Dickens, I did reread his books just for fun via audiobook. Since I started BookTube, I have been doing a bit more rereading, mostly when I want to reread a book for a specific video. So for example, before I made my What the Dickens video talking about every Charles Dickens book a year and a half ago, I reread Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens because I didn't remember it at all. Before I did Bronte Week last year, I reread The Tenant of Wildfire Hall by Anne Bronte because again, I really wanted to talk about it and discuss it, but I didn't really remember it. I reread The Mayor of Casterbridge before I made my 2 weeks of Thomas Hardy series this year. I'm currently rereading a lot of Elizabeth Gaskell's novels and novellas so that I can make a Gaskell week of videos coming up this September. And for my not so hypothetical Victorian literature course videos that I have been doing on this channel, I've been rereading a lot for them as well. Because of all of those BookTube projects, I've actually been rereading much more in 2017 than I have for the last few years. For some reading statistics, I looked back on my reading over the last few years. In 2015, 8 out of the 131 books I read were rereads, which means about 5%. In 2016 it was pretty similar, it was 9 out of 123 books, so that is I think 7%. Then so far this year, in 2017, 10 out of the 60 books I've read have been rereads. That's quite a lot, that's about 17%. So a big chunk, a sixth of the books I've read so far this year have been rereads. And I've been really loving rereading this year. I'm probably at some point in the next week going to do the mid-year freakout tag because everyone has been doing it and it's really fun. And as I'm sure many other booktubers do, while I was watching other people's videos of the mid-year freakout tag, I was thinking about how I would answer the questions. One of the questions on that tag is, what's the best book you've read so far this year? And when I started to think about the best books I've read so far this year, my favourite reading experiences of the year, all of them have been rereads. Like most of my favourite reads this year, with the exception, I suppose, of The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope, which is absolutely brilliant. Like all of my other favourite books so far this year have been rereads for me. I have been loving rereading so much, and I think rereading is really important, and I sometimes feel like we don't do it enough. For me, when I reread a book, I often get more out of it than the first time. Obviously there are some things that you can never get again. You can never get the shock of turns in the plot in the same way as when you read a book for the first time, but I do think you can pick up on things and you can also be comfortable with the book from the beginning. Like in a lot of books, especially in a lot of classics, I spend like the first 8 chapters getting into the story and working out who everyone is, whereas when you're rereading something you already know, so you can fully enjoy the book. As well, there's something just really comforting about knowing what's going to happen and knowing where things are going. Sometimes that's just a really nice reading experience. I noticed a few years ago that whenever I make lists of my favourite novels of all time, they're always books that I've studied at university or at school, and for a while I thought that was just because I really enjoy studying books, and when I study a book I often get a lot more out of it. But actually I don't think it's really to do with the studying at all. I think it's more that when I studied a book at university or at school, I read it several times. Wuthering Heights, for example, I consider like my 3rd favourite book of all time. I love it so much. I studied it at A-level and at university. I must have read it 10 times. I think Wuthering Heights is the book I've read the most ever, and that's increased my love of it because every time I read it I'm like, oh, it's so good, and I discover so many new and important things that I love about it. Like I haven't reread it for a couple of years and I feel really sad about that. Like I really want to reread Wuthering Heights at the moment. For me there is something so wonderful and so magical about rereading. I also find, as someone who enjoys analysis, as someone who enjoys looking at themes and looking at language and seeing all the interesting things and working out how things work, for me I can do that much more on a reread. When I reread a book, especially a classic, I can make tabs and I can make notes and I can think about stuff in a way I don't normally do on the first read through. For example, but I know some people find this weird, when I read classics I never look at the notes. Like if there's footnotes, if there's endnotes, I never look at them. I never read them because they disrupt from the story for me, and when I read classics a lot of the time it's for the story and I want to read on and find out what happens, and if there's 1 or 2 sentences I don't understand, then that's kind of fine. On a reread I will actually look at the notes and I will discover new little references and subtleties that I didn't notice on the first time round, and I really like that. Also, I feel like I've got to the stage now where I kind of have to reread stuff. Not that there's millions and millions of books that I haven't read, but I love Victorian literature. My passion, my favourite thing to read about is Victorian literature. Obviously there are a lot of Victorian novels, and there are still a lot of Victorian novels that I haven't read yet, but I love Victorian literature. My passion, my favourite thing to read about is Victorian literature. Obviously there are a lot of Victorian novels, and there are still a lot of Victorian novels that I haven't read yet, but I love Victorian literature. My passion, my favourite thing to read about is Victorian literature. Obviously there are a lot of Victorian novels that I haven't read yet, but I read like all of the great Victorian classics, all of the most famous Victorian novels except A Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Like all of the rest of them, all of the rest of the really, really famous ones, I read before I was 18 and I've forgotten most of them. Take Dickens for example. As I spoke about in my video on Monday, I had read all of Charles Dickens's novels by the time I was 17. I had read all of my favourite authors' books by the time I was 17. So what else am I supposed to do? What was I supposed to do from that point onwards except reread them again and again and again? Except for maybe also read like all of his shorter works and his non-fiction, which I still haven't done. But I love his novels very, very much. And I'm obviously not going to just never read a Dickens novel for the rest of my life, which means my only option is to reread them again and again and again. And I do get much more out of them, and I do learn new things and discover new things and notice new intricacies. Partly I think because when you read something again, you notice different things because you're not having to pay attention to things that you are now familiar with. And partly I think because things change as you get older. I reread North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell earlier this year, and I loved it so much more than I ever have before. I've always loved it a lot, but there are so many things in it that I think especially affected me or like interested me at this point in my life and made me love it so much more and made me understand it and connect with it more than I had when I was younger. So much that I declared that it had beaten Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens and was now my second favourite book of all time. I've also really enjoyed rereading Harry Potter over the last couple of years. I made a video a few months ago called J.K. Rowling versus Charles Dickens where I talked about the similarities and differences between J.K. Rowling and Charles Dickens. That was prompted because I reread Harry Potter as an adult and loved it much more than I did as a child. I liked it as a child, but it was not the big thing. It was not, that didn't have that massive impact on me that it had on most of my generation, and I always felt like I kind of missed out on something that was supposed to be incredibly important for everyone my age. And then I read it as an adult and I got it much more and I enjoyed them a lot more, and that came through rereading, and I wouldn't have got that experience and I wouldn't have had at least some like little glimmer of the shared bond with the rest of the people my age if I hadn't reread them. And I think what I'm trying to say is that rereading is brilliant and wonderful, and I highly, highly encourage it. I think BookTube for me has been simultaneously really good at encouraging me to reread and really good at discouraging me from rereading. In one sense it has been good at encouraging me to reread, especially a lot of my old favourite 19th century books, because I want to make videos about them and I want to talk about them, and I don't feel confident and comfortable talking about a book that I read 9 years ago and barely remember. That's why I've been rereading books for the Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course. It's because I want to talk about them in an interesting and informed way, and to do that I have to reread the books. And so in that way BookTube and the different projects I have on BookTube has been encouraging me to reread a lot more than I ever would have done without BookTube. At the same time, BookTube is a place that is full of books, that is overstuffed with books, where every time you watch any video you want to add like 5 books to your TBR. The TBR of the physical books I own on my shelf and haven't read yet is pretty long, and then the TBR of books that I would like to acquire or books that sound really interesting that I've heard about through BookTube is incredibly long. And it's going to take me so long to get through all of these books. When you're on BookTube and you're hearing about all of these books and there are so many things that you want to read, it does encourage you, I think, to prioritise new books so that you can get through more new books, so that you can read the books that everyone is talking about now rather than books that you've already read, which you've already like ticked off your list. And BookTube does, I think, kind of promote that checklist mentality. That's not a complaint. I don't think that's necessarily a problem, although it can be at times. But I think BookTube and the focus on like numbers and how many things can you read and Goodreads challenges and ticking things off on your Goodreads does encourage you to prioritise new books over old books, and encourages you to view reading as a thing where you have to be constantly achieving stuff. And this I think is the problem for me, which put me off rereading for a long time and made me reread less, because I felt like when I was rereading I wasn't achieving something, I wasn't like getting further in the world of books that I have to like read everything as much as possible. I wasn't achieving something, whereas if I was reading a new book I'd feel like I was achieving something. But this year, because I've been rereading a lot of the time for a specific purpose, for specific BookTube videos I want to make, I don't feel like I'm not achieving anything by rereading, and therefore I feel more comfortable with rereading and therefore I enjoy it much more. And that just made me realise that sometimes the way I approach reading is wrong, because if I think about reading not as an achievement, not as like ticking this off my list, if I think of it just like, okay, I have 3 hours, I want to do something I love, what am I going to do? Then actually I am just as likely, and often more likely, to enjoy those 3 hours if I spend them rereading a book than if I'm reading a new book. And that doesn't mean that I'm just going to reread things and never going to read any new books. Obviously I'm going to read new books, and obviously I think the amount of new books I read is always going to outweigh the number of books I reread, but I've just been thinking so far this year that I love rereading and I should reread more, and rereading is a glorious, wonderful thing, and we shouldn't forget about it on BookTube. We shouldn't. But yes, I just wanted to share with you my love of rereading, and that is pretty much all I had to say for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back next time with another bookish video.